Today's webinar will focus on the college campus turmoil, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and academic unease. Thank you for joining CIE's weekly analysis of the Hamas-Israel war. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and Emory University professor emeritus of contemporary Middle Eastern history, political science, and Israel studies. Please note that all of our previous webinars are archived on our website, israeled.org, in audio or visual access. Just go to the Hamas button, press it, and you will see all of the previous webinars. About our Center for Israel Education, we've been writing curriculum, providing sources, teaching, and engaging the general public with our website. We've been able to touch 40,000 viewers a week, more than 7 million users since we launched the website in 2015. We know people want trustworthy and reliable information, and they're not interested in polemics. Israel is more than the conflict. It's a story of Jewish self-determination and how Jews continue to shape their own Jewish future at israeled.org. If you like what you see, if you like what you hear, if you like what you use, don't hesitate to donate to support our work. Our center has dedicated substantive and substantial learning about Israel and has probed the issues, responses, controversies, and aspects of this war. Its very dramatic and very traumatic impact on Israel and the region, Palestinians, diaspora Jews, and found expressions of support as well as contempt that unfolded after October 7th. Today's webinar will look at the underpinnings of the outbreaks of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the academic turmoil that has unfolded on campus. Joining us will be Joanna Mendelson from Los Angeles, where she's the Vice President of Outreach and Community Engagement. Jonathan Schanzer, who's Vice President of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington. And Jonathan Rynhold, who's Head of the Political Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. The trigger to the Hamas-Israel war was the genocidal attack of Hamas terrorists on Israelis and others on that Saturday morning of October 7, resulting in 1,200 Israelis murdered, women raped, babies killed, 240 hostages taken to Gaza for political bargaining purposes. Israel has sought to eliminate the existential threat that Hamas poses, maneuvering between the caring and condemnatory commentaries poured at Israel for engaging in self-defense. Joanna, tell us a little bit about the incidents that unfolded on the UCLA campus. Like many campuses that underwent a lot of turmoil and sustained protests from late April forward.
One of my first jobs right out of Emory University was working to monitor neo-Nazis and white supremacists, anti-government extremists, really the underbelly of our community in dark web spaces and social media. And when we talk about right-wing extremism, it was obvious. You've got the blazing swastikas, you have the ideology that is very, very fringe. And we saw for a long time the trajectory of anti-Semitism increasing year over year, increasing 100% from one year to the next. And in the last 5 years, the highest years on record. But what we saw after October 7th was this real paradigm shift of the type of rhetoric and the type of concerns that we were seeing coming from across the spectrum, but specifically on the left. And so we were always concerned about the rhetoric, always concerned about the climate on campuses. And actually 2 years ago, we proposed a conference on the West Coast, bringing together 120 provosts, deans, and administrators at the university. And the conference was planned 3 weeks after October 7th. So unfortunately, it was really an exhibit A for us to experience what we were seeing on campus. Almost immediately following October 7th, we had perhaps a few weeks of maybe remorse, of sadness, of kind of empathy for the Israeli community and those who were victims of the Hamas attacks. But very, very quickly after that, we saw the vitriol, we saw groups rising up together, and some of the anti-Semitism rising. When we see all Jews held accountable for what happens in Israel, that is anti-Semitism. And so this is a pattern that we've seen play out, whether or not it was the war in Gaza previously, whether or not it's any type of Middle East turmoil. We've tracked it for years. What happens abroad actually manifests here in the US. And we see that as synagogues are targeted or all Jews are held responsible for various issues. So this conference actually was a really important starting point for us to have these conversations, because really free speech is king on campus. And in all ways, we want to protect free speech, but we need to kind of figure out the mechanisms and the tools that we can push back against that speech that is anti-Semitic, that is bigoted, that is hateful, and that ultimately creates a climate that's detrimental for the Jewish community. And so what we saw taking place on these campuses was rather alarming. The kind of disregard for some of the encampments that were essentially violations of school policy. If you look at UCLA, for example, it's very clearly laid out in their policy booklet that you can't have an encampment on campus. Very specifically outlines that encampments are illegal on their campus. And yet administration for over 7 days chose to not address the growing camps that were developing. We're talking chairs and sofas and boards and so forth. They were able to bring the metal barricades onto campus. Law enforcement described the encampment as one of the largest encampments of content and material since the Vietnam War that they had to remove. And it's one thing to have free speech. We can all support that. Time, place, and manner restrictions. But there were no guardrails around what we saw emerging from the UCLA campus in particular. And in fact, it reached somewhat of a boiling point. Students were actually denied from accessing various places when wearing a Magen David, a Star of David necklace, based on their ideology, based on their belief system, based on the fact that they identified as Zionists. They were restricted from accessing the library, classrooms, specific halls. And so we got to a point where the climate on campus, the ethos, the culture was really detrimental for the Jewish community. Again, it's one thing for free speech, but it's another thing when the environment is not supportive and doesn't allow for Jewish students or any minority groups to thrive on campus. We met confidentially with the chancellor, with Hillel personnel, with deans and so forth, kind of pushing and saying, at what point are we going to take action? Because the community was deeply, deeply concerned. Ultimately, we saw violence perpetrated by mostly Jewish group on the encampment, which has to be condemned. We must maintain the upper hand in all aspects of this. And we saw bear mace being used by the encampment on those who tried to dismantle. We saw violent actions, brawls, and confrontations. We saw a lack of leadership, no presence of law enforcement over a 5-hour period that finally came onto the scene at like 3 a.m. But we saw the tensions just mounting and rising with no elements to put a stop to this. And so now we have to pick up the pieces. UCLA is just one example of the rest of the country of what we're seeing. What kind of tools do we need to bring to bear in this current moment? How do we address this conflict? And we need to figure out and think strategically, because the summer months are here, but we're about to enter the fall, and this is not going away. So how do we retool and how do we address these issues?
The phrases and the tropes that were used by the protesters on campus, were they distinctly anti-Semitic? Could you identify them as having had their origins from a previous decade or several decades?
Absolutely. So we always see these macro conspiracies, whether it's Jewish power and control, or a larger cabal, or just the denial of the right of Israel to exist. For example, a very large pig was erected on campus, and he's holding the scales of justice. And on one side, you have kind of a tzedakah box or a Jewish symbol, Israeli flag, tipping the scales upwards, and you have the Palestinian cause and all things associated with the Palestinians being put down. So a very in-your-face reference of Jewish greed, of Jewish money, of Jewish profiting, and the same macro conspiracies that we see used from way back when being illustrated today. The graffiti was rampant that had very anti-Semitic language on it. We saw swastikas, very clear indications of anti-Semitism beyond criticism of the politics, beyond criticism of the government, beyond criticism of even military actions, but very specifically directing and targeting of the Jewish community.
What's happening in America began in Europe in 1975, when the UN General Assembly passed Zionism as racism. by 1982, during the First Lebanon War, you had Jewish societies on university campuses being banned by student unions run by hard left political groups, Trotskyites and the like. By the time I was at university, during the first Intifada, the atmosphere was pretty difficult. And you were beginning to have Arab students who were actually expelled from Britain during the Gulf War. In 2005, I was already a lecturer in Israel, but the academic boycott passed by the Association of University Teachers in Britain began by targeting Haifa University in Bar-Ilan. And since I was British, and since I'm in the political science department, and since I'm at Bar-Ilan, I got chosen to start to deal with this. But what I'd like to do is talk a little bit from my research about American attitudes towards Israel and how they've developed. What I would like to do is take a step back and say, why does this radical anti-Semitic discourse resonate now when it didn't resonate in America in the past? It resonated in Europe for a long time, and America was immune. Just to give you a sense of it, between 2005 and 2014, the Democratic Party increasingly identified as liberal, but the percentage of Democrats that sympathized with Israel went up. So that's how different America was. So what's happened? Well, between the parties, between liberals and conservatives, from the 1990s to 2014, they disagreed about policy, what Israeli policy should be to the Palestinians, what US policy should be to Israel and the Palestinians. But sympathy for Israel over the Palestinians remained 2 to 3 to the advantage of Israel. Favorable attitudes towards Israel also 2 or 3 times among Democrats, never mind Republicans, and stable. That's the thing, stable. Since 2015, the underlying split is generational and ideological. It is less purely about party. It is far more about those under 35 and those over 35. And within the Democrats, it's between what Americans call progressives or very liberal, what the rest of us in Europe and in Israel call the far left, and liberals and conservatives. And if I have one piece of advice from Britain to you, is never, ever refer to the people demonstrating as very liberal or liberal. They are anti-liberal. They should be termed not even progressive, they should be termed extreme left, because really their ideology is far more associated with the extreme left, and exposing that is going to be very important to defeating it. If we look at the polling of young Americans done by Harvard-Harris, it's very confused. The under 35s are very confused. On the one hand, they seem to be radical leftists who think in terms of races as classes. So here's quotes from Britain during the academic boycott, and then I'll pin them onto attitudes among young Americans. One of the leading leftist organizers of BDS in Britain said, from the standpoint of Marxism, an illiterate, conservative, superstitious Muslim Palestinian peasant who supports Hamas is more progressive than an educated liberal atheist Israeli who supports Zionism even critically. One of the editors in The Guardian around the same time said the following: white people need to accept that no matter how many anti-racist demos they've marched on, they inevitably make assumptions which are influenced by a racist society. As a black man, I'm bound to suffer prejudices of my own, but I cannot be racist because in the global order, I do not belong to the dominant group. In other words, it doesn't matter what your beliefs are, doesn't matter what your values are, it doesn't even matter what your actions are. If you are white and strong, you are wrong. Doesn't matter what your values, doesn't matter what your behavior. And now if we look at Harvard and the polling from December, we can see that a majority of those under 24 and almost half of those under 34 agreed that Jews are a class of oppressors that should be treated as oppressors, and that isn't a false ideology. 2/3 of the under 35s think Hamas's attacks on Israel were genocidal, and yet more than half think that the Hamas attacks could be justified by the grievances of the Palestinians. So here you have resonance for a radical leftist ideology, which says it's about, are you black? Are you white? Are you strong? Are you wrong? All in inverted commas, not objectively true. But there is confusion in these attitudes. So in the same survey, 70 to 80% of under 35s think Israel has a right to exist as the homeland of the Jewish people. Similar percentage think Israel has a right to defend itself, including launching airstrikes in heavily populated Palestinian areas. And about 2/3 to 70% think Israel is trying to avoid civilian casualties. This is confusion. And the key to dealing with it is to sharpen the distinction between small L liberals, which is most Americans, whether you call yourself conservative. In other words, people who believe that the choices we make as people, as individuals, matter. And therefore we judge someone by their behavior and their attitudes and not by their color and not by how much money they've got. And to sharpen that distinction, it's very important to frame the language as a two-sided conflict and not a one-sided conflict. They will say ending the occupation. We have to say two states living side by side in peace and security. And when they say things that are demonizing Israel, I have a nice line from Rabbi Michael Melchior: you can't make peace with the devil, he cannot be a half devil. Peace is something that liberals are supposed to believe in. Dialogue is something that liberals are supposed to believe in. Exposing and sharpening the distinction between the hard left and the soft liberal center is the key. Another thing I would say, particularly with universities, and this is something we did in England, is to look at the anti-discrimination policies of academic associations and universities, because often they contain things that you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of color, religion, or nationality. Therefore, boycotting an Israeli student or a Jewish professor may actually be against the law. In England, discrimination is the phrase you want to use. I don't know American law, but this is what forced the Association of University Teachers to say that they're not boycotting Israel, they're only having a campaign to boycott Israel, because according to their bylaws, it was illegal. And so I think testing these policies against the law or against the regulations of their associations like the International Studies Association, if it wants to boycott Israel, could expose them to a very, very expensive legal case, which is a good threat. The other thing, and again, I don't know what the situation is in America, but in Britain, for many years, student leaders were taken to Israel on visits, organized by the Union of Jewish Students, which is a little bit different from Hillel because it's run by the students. And that's important because it means that it's students talking to students, not professional community educators talking to students. It's a very different type of dialogue. And that meant that we have members of the Labour Party who grew up in the atmosphere that I described earlier, who when Jeremy Corbyn, who is one of these far-left anti-Semites in the Labour Party, was saying what he was saying, the deputy head of the party, who comes from a town with no Jews, but who'd been to Israel on a trip when he was a student, got up at the Labour Party conference and started singing Am Yisrael Chai. Now, he is not an evangelical Christian. In Israel, he would vote Meretz. He's on the left. But people in Britain in the Labour Party understood that core democratic, small L liberal or small S social democratic values were at stake here, and that this was an attempt by anti-democratic leftist forces to wheedle their way in alliance with Islamists, what we call the Red-Green Alliance. For them, it became an existential issue, and they became very, very important allies. So I would say that the lessons there are to invest in young people, to relate what I call horses for courses, which means lawyers speak to lawyers, professors speak to professors, and students speak to students. You don't speak down, you speak across. I think that, and distinguishing between the radical left and the soft liberals. Soft liberals, we might disagree on policy. Fair enough, perfectly legitimate. But the radical left need to be exposed for what they are.
Jonathan Schanzer, you've written about Hamas very extensively and very completely. You've studied the PA very extensively. And you also worked in the Department of Treasury, and you at times followed the money. Tell us from October 7th forward how you've been able to understand better what has happened from the context of your previous training and your previous writings.
Let me maybe start by saying this. We know the primary groups driving the protests. I think it's no secret to say that it's Students for Justice in Palestine. That is the primary pro-Palestinian group that's on campus, that's been engaging in these encampments. To go back and take a look at SJP, just so we're following the networks, not the money just yet. SJP was created by a man named Hatem Bazian. Hatem Bazian created the first SJP chapter at the University of California, Berkeley in the late 1990s, early 2000s. He's actually still a professor there today. When he created this first grouping, it was not institutionalized. It was really a one-off. But Bazian went on in 2006 to become the founder and chairman of an organization called American Muslims for Palestine, based in the Chicago area, Bridgeview, Illinois. And within the structures of AMP, within American Muslims for Palestine, we saw funding for various SJP chapters. The research that I've done going back 2014, 15, and 16, we could actually see photos of students holding up checks at AMP events, and AMP seeded that they were providing at one point about $100,000 a year to the various campus organizations, where they were literally cultivating armies of activists. And this has now been going on for the better part of a decade or more. What's really interesting, though, is you need to take a look at who AMP is. And that's where this has been the most interesting for me over the last 7 months, maybe even over the last decade. AMP is an organization that is forged out of 3 charities that were shut down in the United States for Hamas finance. The first one is a one that most people are familiar with, a group called the Holy Land Foundation that was shut down by the FBI in 2001. After that organization was shut down, a new group sprouted up. Whereas the Holy Land was based in Richardson, Texas, this new one called Kind Hearts was forged in Toledo, Ohio. The Treasury Department, where I was working at the time, we shut down Kind Hearts, noting that it was the progeny of the Holy Land Foundation. That was exactly what the Treasury Department issued in a statement. And then there was one other charity that was also shut down called Islamic Association for Palestine. It was found guilty in a civil suit. The family of a young man named David Boehm sued this organization because it was essentially the public relations firm for Holy Land. The 3 organizations that I've just described have contributed somewhere between 8 and 9 individuals to AMP. In other words, AMP today is populated by people that used to work for these charities that were shut down in the US government. And what's amazing is that when you fast forward to just the last couple of months and you look at the photos and the videos and the literature at these encampments, we could see the hand of AMP throughout. We have photos of Hatem Bazian across the University of California system. He has actually showed up at UCLA, at Berkeley, at University of San Diego, at Irvine, at Santa Cruz. We actually also saw him at Penn, and he was engaging actively with the students. This is not a student, by the way. We're talking about a full-grown adult whose job is to organize. The executive director of AMP, a man by the name of Osama Abu Ershad, we've seen him at GW, at Columbia, and other campuses. We have photos of him where he's holding the microphone and speaking at the encampments, at their press conferences. He is riling up the crowds. And so if you're wondering where some of the rhetoric is coming from, where the organizational components of this are coming from, they're coming from one group, primarily from the outside, and that is American Muslims for Palestine. They're now based in Falls Church, Virginia. They moved here a few years ago. They're apparently extremely active right now as we watch them engage in campuses across the United States. Now, one last thing that I'll just say here, I think the schools themselves were caught flat-footed by this. They really had no idea what was coming. They may have known that SJP was a somewhat radical group and that the students were going to engage in certain tactics that they may not have appreciated, but the extent of the violence and the disruption of what's happened on campus, the intimidation, the hate speech, I think this took a lot of schools by surprise. By the way, the arrest numbers, and I've gotten this from university presidents as well as from law enforcement and from federal law enforcement, we're now learning that 2/3 of all of those who were arrested at these encampments were not students. So we can very clearly see the impact of organizations like AMP and others. We need to acknowledge that there are other groups out there as well, socialist groups, communist groups, anarchist groups that are contributing. But I think the key driver of these messages, the key driver of the culture on the campuses right now can track back to this one group, American Muslims for Palestine, which helped to incubate and grow Students for Justice in Palestine. And it is impossible to talk about these things without noting the previous activities of those that forged AMP. These are extremists at the end of the day. Now, whether you call them Hamas or Hamas adjacent or something else, that is for you to decide. But clearly, we can see the influence of this group on campus right now and the troubling impact that it has made on campuses across the country.
Jonathan Rynhold, you wrote a piece in 2013 in the Times of Israel, in which you said, while BDS is not going to bring Israel to its knees, it has the potential to inflict substantial diplomatic, economic, and even military damage on Israel over time. If the current round of peace talks fail, the Palestinians will go to the UN and other international bodies in an effort to generate sanctions against Israel with regard to settlements. In addition, every time there's a major conflagration, they will try to take Israeli army officers to the international court. I hate to say it, but history seems to be replicating itself. So we have a combination, Joanna, of anti-Semitic statements. We have a generational gap. Jonathan Schanzer told us about the origins. It all sounds like it's very conducive to a fire that can't be put out. What should administrators do? What can they do? What can they do proactively to curb this fire from turning into a massive conflagration?
Jonathan just mentioned that they were found flat-footed. Here's an opportunity with the summer months to retool, to figure out how they are going to strengthen the guardrails, provide protection to students, balance that free speech opportunity with an environment that is suitable and that Jews can thrive, and all students can thrive, frankly. What we saw that was lacking in many ways was the silence that we wouldn't see necessarily if other groups were demeaned or defamed, that we would expect our leadership to kind of lean in on. So the first thing is using their bully pulpit. All the chancellors, presidents across the universities have an opportunity to clearly and vociferously state what is acceptable and to denounce what they see on their campus. When they fail to do that, they create a vacuum that essentially gives life to this culture on campus. The universities that have been very, very direct, very, very clear on what is acceptable on their campus and what is not, have created and responded to the incidents much more effectively. The second thing is if they have these policies on their books, they need to enforce them. So they need to have very clear communication. They need to figure out exactly what they will permit and what actions they will follow through on. We saw some universities issue statements of what was not allowed, And the very next day, the students did exactly what was not allowed, and there was no repercussion. So not only do we need the guardrails, but we need them to actually enforce them. And there has to be some thought given to not capitulating on the demands. We saw egregious incidents like here in California at Sonoma State University, where the president, perhaps and ostensibly to allow graduation to proceed, gave in to all sorts of BDS demands. In fact, actually canceled all trips to Israel for study abroad programs, denied organizations from Israel. Individual Israelis were allowed on campus, but not organizations, offering student groups, SJP in particular, which we heard about, opportunities to sit on BDS assessment task force. Within 24 hours, we issued a letter convening JPAC, our Jewish Public Affairs Committee, JCRC, and Federation, and then an action alert. And within 24 hours, he was removed from his position and he issued an apology. So we have to be very careful that they're not capitulating on their demands. We're seeing this in some ways as a whack-a-mole game. We just issued a letter to the UCs and the CSUs, the University of California and the California State Universities, to create a top-down system so that we're not dealing with this BDS piecemeal. UC Riverside, for example, is just standing up a task force and had a briefing last week before the trustees to entertain possibilities of BDS. And I think we just have to elevate in this moment. State laws have to be strengthened. So luckily, we helped to stand up and support legislation put forth by Assemblymember Bloom that actually denies any state entity from receiving state funding if they embrace boycott, divestment, and sanction, stating that it is denying that free speech and denying opportunities of exchange of ideas. So essentially, our activism now is focused on ensuring that all the universities statewide are aware of this legislation, that they will be denied funding. And now we have to look at what kind of prosecutorial measures or what kind of teeth we can put towards that to make it a little bit stronger. One of the things that we've realized that we have to mobilize is that there's so many organizations in this space. And how do we put aside our organizational differences and focus on the mission? And so one of the ways I think that we've really successfully been able to do that is through our Anti-Semitism Roundtable. 2 years ago, we erected an organization bringing together all the groups in Los Angeles that address anti-Semitism and figuring out what are our core competencies and how do we address this issue in a collective voice. And so we've issued in the last 1 month 5 letters to various chancellors, UC regents, and so forth, and had joint meetings coming together collectively so that we can push back on this current climate.
In Britain, incitement to racial hatred is against the law, not just to violence. I presume in America it probably isn't. So you don't have the same tools, but nonetheless, as I said, you should look very, very closely at the bylaws of universities. Almost certainly anything that's against an individual is illegal, for any kind of prejudice. The other thing is to follow up on what Jonathan really is doing, which is exposing who they really are, and also filming what's said, who does what, putting names to faces, all those kind of things. And the other thing I think is to think of university administrators as cowards, because that's what they are. So generally, you need to have a good cop and a bad cop. And the community organizations are probably going to be the good cop. But you do need bad cops. You do need them. You do need people who are going to take them to court. And you do need people who are going to make their lives difficult because they need to feel the pressure from both sides. And then you can offer them a nice way out. I think it's wrong to think in terms of an orchestra and right to think in terms of jazz. Jazz is everyone does their own thing, but somehow it coheres. You don't want to think of it as a top-down strategy. It needs to be a lot more fluid, and you have to allow different groups to say things in the way that they're comfortable with, as long as it's round a core, which is we're against BDS, this is anti-Semitism, and the state of Israel has a right to exist as the homeland of the Jewish people. After that, let people be as outrageously critical and disagree with each other as much as possible, because that will only help the credibility that they have with people who think like them. And it's better to have a mixture of voices around a call and sometimes less coordination than more coordination.
Jonathan Schanzer, I'm sure you've given this some thought. You got any RX? Can I go to Walgreens or CVS and get a prescription filled?
You can. There are some things that I think schools need to be thinking about right now, and I think they are to one extent or another. In my discussions with presidents and deans and provosts over the last several months, as I've briefed them on who is behind the chaos, there was one excellent idea that came up, and now it's been embraced by a couple of schools. You may see some schools actually hire outside investigators to reconstruct what happened over the last couple of months, to be able to identify who the outside agitators were, to identify those that were arrested. And there are, of course, arrest records of the individuals. There are mugshots and rap sheets that we can now point to. So you may be able to identify if there were professional agitators on campus. Trying to identify who the students were who succumbed to the influence of some of these radical outside agitators is also important. The idea is not to stop free speech. It's not to stop free expression, but the idea is to try to at least diagnose what happened on campus so that you can prevent it again. If you don't know what happened, then you certainly will not know how to make sure that it doesn't flare back up again in September. Now, beyond that, there are still some other things that I think can be done. Physical security becomes a big problem when you're allowing people with a past connection to Hamas or other violent groups onto campus. Now, in some cases, it's going to be very hard to stop people from coming on campus, like at Columbia University, where it's in the middle of one of the biggest cities in the world. Try to stop people from going on campus. But there are other campuses where you can probably establish perimeters so that adults that have no business being there cannot access the quad. And that, by the way, is smart policy for every one of these schools who are worried about their fiduciary responsibilities. They're worried about whether they could be held responsible for violence that takes place on campus. This is really not hard stuff for universities to digest here. It really is just a question of will. Each school is going to have its own flavor here, and not every administration is going to be a profile in courage. But I do believe that schools, once they begin to understand that there are outside agitators that are a key part of the problem, are going to start to take a look at literally physical defense and perimeter measures that can be taken. Now, the last thing that I'll just say here on the tolerance of anti-Semitic rhetoric and activity on campus. This strikes me as a hugely important issue, certainly with the Ivy League schools that got hauled up before Congress early on after 10/7, and they were just excoriated by members of Congress, and I think deservedly so. The question is why they were willing to countenance this on campus, why they felt that this was something that they could get away with. And I think on that, we really do need to look at the phenomenon of sovereign wealth from foreign countries pouring into schools. For many, many decades in this country, it was the alumni networks that kept the schools not only solvent, but thriving. It was money that came in from proud graduates and from the proud parents of graduates. They wanted to support the school that helped their kids or helped themselves get to where they were. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen a surge in foreign funding. And in particular, I look at countries like Qatar, which is an oil-rich country of 330,000 citizens. They have no discernible interest in flooding our university systems with cash, but that's exactly what they're doing. And we've seen something like $6 billion of Qatari money flood the higher education system here in the United States over the last 10 years. The question is why? What do they want from us? What is it that they're trying to influence here in the United States? There needs to be greater scrutiny of what foreign money is being flooded into our academic institutions, because at the end of the day, what's happening is that these sovereign wealth funds are obviating the school's need to rely on those individual donors that have made up the backbone, that have made up really the soul of the curriculum and the core of the culture of our universities. There's a major problem that needs to be addressed. We've seen the Department of Education begin to dig into this. I think Chairwoman Fox has done terrific work so far, and hauling a bunch of schools and university professors onto Capitol Hill and demanding answers. But I think we're just scratching the surface right now. More needs to be done. More transparency is urgently required. I think right now the buck stops with the federal government in terms of preventing this culture from escalating.
This is a heavy moment. This is in some ways an existential threat for us and the way forward. How are we seeing whether or not it's the faculty response and holding encampments and the classes within the encampments, how the university leadership is responding. There's a lot of really disconcerting elements of the landscape that we see unfolding. But if I can actually leave you with some positivity, what we have seen working in the trenches right now from the students has been incredible. This is a moment in which we are seeing students really, really harness their voices, and they are leaning in, they are leading, they are wearing their Jewish stars proudly. We had 12 students fly in from all over the state to testify before the UC Regent at UCLA, using their voices to communicate to their leadership what they will not accept. And so this is a moment where we must continue to empower, to support the students, to really listen to their voices and approach all of the issues in a student-centered mentality so that we can have Jewish joy survive on campus, Jewish joy really fully blossom on our campuses. That is the end goal. We are very, very much focused on the cancer that is taking place on campus, but we must also step back and say that this doesn't define the campus life. This is a small element of it. And as we've heard, that majority of it is coming from the outside. So let's put that into perspective in terms of the university culture and continue to empower our students as we move forward.
Three of you have empowered all of us today with great insights and true understanding. If you enjoyed today and if you enjoy learning about modern Israel and its self-determination and understanding the issues that confront it, go to our website, israeled.org, and press the donate button.